Hi, so thank you very much for having me with you today. I'm really excited to join you and to be able to talk to you about the IUCN Green Status of Species and how I see that this could maybe work with the conservation standards. So for a bit of background on me, I'm Dr. Rebecca Young and I work as a conservation scientist in Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. And I've spent the last almost 2 years working on the IUCN Green Status of Species in order to develop this tool to be able to be used to look at program impact evaluation. And previously, several years ago, when I first worked with Durrell, I did an internship in the conservation effectiveness team, which was very heavily focused on the conservation standards. And it was something that, as I was going through, I've seen a lot of things align between these two frameworks. And I think it's potentially a really interesting opportunity to try and get together people from sort of both areas using both of these frameworks and see if we can kind of integrate them together and make the most of the information that we're gathering for one or other of the framework to potentially feed into both of them. So I'm going to start with kind of introducing some general overarching goals I think would be good to keep in mind as I go through and introduce the green status in a bit more detail, particularly if you're not that familiar with it, but some of the things that I see as kind of generally quite paralleled between the two. So then, as I said, I'll go into a bit more of an explanation about the green status, followed by my work on program evaluation and how I see that the two could be combined. So first of all, thinking about these kind of general goals. So both the green status, the work that I've been doing on establishing a program level green status of species assessment and the conservation standards are both wanting to understand, are we achieving impact? So is the conservation that we're doing actually having an effect? And both of these frameworks help to bridge the gap between conservation research and conservation in practice. So if you kind of look at the two ends of the spectrum from a pure practitioner through to a pure researcher, impact evaluation is really key in bridging this gap. So taking what we've learnt through research and applying it in the field, and vice versa, looking at what we're doing in the field and researching to understand that. So impact evaluation bridges this gap, and so does adaptive management. It helps us to feed the information that we have into the work in order to make it as efficient as possible. Something else I think is really key is both of these frameworks encourage long-term thinking, and that's something that's crucial in conservation today. We've got to be thinking about the long-term future. And finally, sharing results is again really key. As conservationists, we're not great at it all the time, but we can learn so much from each other. So the importance of sharing results is something that I think can come from both of these. So with that in mind, I'm going to give an introduction to the green status of species for those who are not so familiar with it. So most of us will be very familiar with the IUCN Red List. So this is a widely used tool in conservation, and it specifically assesses the risk of species going extinct. And it's a global standard for informing conservation action. But for a long time, there was a feeling within the conservation community that we didn't have a way of understanding the impact of what we were doing specifically. So whilst you can get a feel for this with the Red List, for example, a change in category, there wasn't a metric that was specifically to understand species recovery and the impact of conservation. And so this is where the IUCN Green Status of Species comes in. So it was a long time in development, and it was launched in 2021 as a new part of the Red List. And this assesses how close a species is to being fully recovered. And the idea is it's to understand the past and the potential future importance of conservation actions within species recovery. And part of this is coming from an idea that we don't want to just see stop species from going extinct. As conservationists, we want to strive for more than this. So the idea behind it being we want to see species thrive, not just survive. And there are kind of 5 sort of key points that the green status of species aims to address. And I'm going to introduce here 4 of the metrics as to how we understand species success, species conservation success. And don't worry, I will be going back to them to give you a bit more detail about what each of those metrics means. So first of all, the idea is to provide this standardized framework for measuring species recovery. So just like the Red List, the guidelines can be picked up by anyone across the world and followed to get comparable results on species recovery. And then some really big questions we wanted to understand is, what has conservation achieved to date? And so the metric we use to measure this is the conservation legacy. And as I said, I'll come back to these and give you a bit more information about them. We want to know how dependent species are on continued conservation action. And this is reflected in a metric called the conservation dependence. We want to understand how conservation actions are expected to impact the species in the near future. So this is represented by the conservation gain. And thinking about that kind of long-term aspiration, we want to know what species of recovery we could strive to achieve in the long run. And this is the recovery potential. So in all this talk about species recovery, the kind of big overarching, very important question is, when is a species fully recovered? And so the definition that we give within the green status is that a species is considered fully recovered if it's viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. And I realize, again, it's a bit of a mouthy explanation, and I'm going to break it down into the different parts, which each part of this definition kind of forms a key part of a green status assessment. So first of all, we want to think about a species' indigenous range. And so this is described as all known, inferred, or spatially projected sites of occurrence for the species, both current and historical. And this is quite different from the red list, which tends to focus on the current range of the species, whereas we think about where it was found previously as well as where it's found now, with the idea being that we want to understand where a species was present before human interference was the main factor causing its decline. And so, for example, one of the assessments I've been working on recently is the California condor. And you can see this area in orange shows the indigenous range of this species. So then the next thing we want to think about is it ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range? And this is a really important aspect that kind of differentiates the work that I'm doing with the green status from a lot of the comparisons with the red list. So because we use this looking at each part of the range, we have a spatially explicit way of measuring species recovery. So you can see that this indigenous range of the species has been divided up into different areas, which we call spatial units. And the idea of this is we want to capture variation across the species range. And we also want to incentivize conservation across the species range. So whereas in, for example, a red list assessment, we would look at the population across this whole area as one. In the green status, we assess each spatial unit individually. And then the final part of this explanation is we want to think about, is it viable and ecologically functional? So this is kind of going back to that idea of seeing things thrive, seeing things fulfilling their ecological function. So we want to see a species exhibit a full range of ecological interactions and functions within the ecosystem. So going back to that California condor example, some of the functions that we would see from this species is there's a trophic function, it feeds exclusively on carrion, and this in result has an ecosystem function of nutrient cycling. And so we think about that and we set a point where we would say, okay, this is what we would expect to see in a functional population. And from that, we can understand whether we have functional populations within those different spatial units. So that's kind of the background of the different parts that go into that definition and what we have to consider in a green status assessment. But then how do we actually measure the recovery of the species? So we start by assigning a state to each of the spatial units. And it's quite broad, so we put them into 4 categories of absent, present, viable, or functional. So absent is quite straightforward, it's no longer in that spatial unit. Present, it is the species exists in that spatial unit, but it is at risk of being extirpated. For a green status, we have quite a specific definition of viable, where it would be either considered least concern or near threatened, but without a continuing decline. So we're not really seeing a high risk of the species being extirpated, or a functional population where they're fulfilling those ecological functions which we've defined earlier. And so just for example, in this one, you can see that all of these different spatial units have got a state assigned. We don't have any individuals living in this top spatial unit, but the species is present in all the rest of them, but not in sufficient numbers for us to consider it viable. And so all of these different states are assigned a weighting, and these are then used to calculate the states in the different spatial units. And these combine to give us a species recovery score. So it's given as a percentage. And just to give you a sort of a brief idea of that, this percentage ranges all the way from 0%, which is extinct in the wild, because I should add that all of the species involved, all of the individuals involved in a green status assessment must be wild. We don't actually include captive populations within the assessment. So it could be ranging from 0 for extinct in the wild, all the way up to 100%, which is fully recovered or non-depleted. So maybe it's actually never been depleted. And so first of all, we think about the current state of the species. How does it look today based on the best knowledge that we have? And this gives us what we call the species recovery score. And you can see for this one, it's around about 40%. But if you say to someone, oh, my species has a recovery score of 40%, it's not hugely informative. So we have also assigned groupings to these. So just like with the red list, how we've got the different threat categories, we have different categories as well. So ranging from this fully recovered or not depleted, through varying levels of depletion and all the way down to extinct in the wild. So then the next thing that we want to understand, we don't just want to think about how the species is doing currently. We also want to think about the impact that conservation has had in the past and may potentially have in the future. And this is where those metrics that I mentioned earlier come in. And the way that we calculate these is based on various hypothetical scenarios, both past and future, and both with and without conservation. So I'm going to just go through those now. So we have this current state that I've already explained. And then the next thing we think about is, what about a situation where there had been no conservation whatsoever? So they call this the counterfactual current. So a hypothetical scenario where no conservation had ever taken place. And then the difference between the result that we get from this counterfactual scenario and the current scenario gives us that first conservation metric, the conservation legacy. This is, I think, one of I would say my favorite metric, because it allows us to tell kind of the untold story of conservation. So, okay, we may have seen huge amounts of work done, but we're not really seeing the species improving. That actually, when we look at this counterfactual, we consider where the species would be today had we not have done any of this work. You can really see that difference. So then the next elements that we think about are, what do we expect to happen in the short-term future for the species? So again, we're using these hypothetical scenarios of this expected status of the species within each of those spatial units in 10 years' time in two scenarios. So one of them with no conservation. So assuming all conservation were to stop today, where do we expect the species to be in 10 years' time? And if we compare that to the current state, it gives us the conservation dependence metric. So how dependent are the species on continued conservation? We could also think about the current and the sort of the planned future conservation actions and how we expect these to impact the species in 10 years' time. And this difference between this and the current state gives us the conservation gain. So that's what we can expect to achieve over the next 10 years. And then thinking about that long term, we've got thinking 100 years into the future. And this is quite sort of an aspirational one to think of, and it can be quite difficult to think of because there's a lot of uncertainty. But if we think of everything that, if all conservation went to plan, what could we achieve feasibly for this species in 100 years' time? And this gives us the recovery potential. And so that's given you kind of an introduction and a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what the green status is and what it can tell us. Some of the reasons for using it is a great aid for communicating conservation success. So as I mentioned, that conservation legacy. So a really good example is the mountain chicken frog. So this was assessed as critically endangered in 2004. So in the almost 20 years since then, there's been a huge amount of research, there's been conservation interventions, including rescue and release of frogs, but it's still critically endangered. So if we were purely relying on looking at a change in the red list, it would appear that with this species, you could think nothing's been done with it. Whereas if we look at the green status assessment, we see a very different story. So looking at this conservation legacy, you can see that actually, okay, the species hasn't improved from critically endangered, but without the work that we've done, the counterfactual was that this species would be extinct. So the most likely scenario is that this species would have been lost without conservation. And I think that's a really great way for highlighting the impact that we've had, even if we've not been able to change that red list category. It's also really important for highlighting the need for continued conservation. So one thing that is sort of really exciting in the world in conservation is when we get to downlist something, when we get to see all of our work paying off. For example, the panda being downlisted to vulnerable. But there is a risk that the need for continued conservation might be unappreciated in this instance. So for example, the panda, it's not out of the woods, it still needs a lot of work. And this is where that conservation dependence metric can be really, really helpful in helping highlight that, yes, we've come a long way, but if we stop now, we've still got a lot to lose. And another benefit is that it encourages long-term thinking. So that recovery potential element is really important. So the idea is that that sets an aspirational yet achievable vision for the recovery of the species. And this is kind of the first one that pops up to me as seeing some really strong alignment with the conservation standards, is that vision. So the vision statement in the conservation standards is a description of the desired state or the ultimate condition we're working to achieve. And I think particularly if programs are being developed for species, then having a green status assessment and having this recovery potential could be really, really helpful for informing this vision statement and what we could potentially achieve for that species. So to put this all together and see kind of the outputs of a full assessment, this is what we could see for the California condor. So you can see a very, very strong legacy. Without conservation, the species is likely to have gone extinct. In the short term, we actually don't have a strong dependence appearing for this species, but that's because it's a species that reproduces very slowly. So in 10 years' time, it's a very slow improvement, but we do see the potential for a gain. And we see the potential for some long-term recovery for this species. And something else that's quite important to note is, as you'll see, it's not close to 100%, but that's really common for a lot of species just because of the changing world that we live in. So much land is not the way it once was, and a lot of areas are lost for species. So it's very rare for us to get sort of up to 100% recovery. That's not to say it doesn't happen. We've got some examples of it, but it's not necessarily something to be disheartened about if we're not reaching that 100%. So this is looking at all of the conservation actions globally for this species. And the work that I've been doing is looking at, can we use this framework to estimate the impact of more specific actions? Can we hone it in on something more specific to an individual program? And so the work that I've been doing is to adapt this global framework to be able to be used at a program level to incentivize and celebrate conservation actions. So as practitioners, it's really important to assess the impact that we're having on species recovery. And so one great example of this was conducted several years ago by Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, who used a red list index and counterfactual approach again to understand how their species that they work on and that they've been involved with would most likely look in the absence of the conservation that they've contributed to. And that meant they were able to give this conservation impact. But this is not common. This is not something that is done across all organizations. Even for this relatively small organization of Durrell, this was a huge piece of work. And there's currently no standardized way of assessing program impact. So this is where my work comes in, of adapting this global framework of the IUCN Green Status of Species to be able to be used at the program level. And we foresee lots of potential benefits for this. So there could be benefits in terms of policy. So if we can define a program, for example, at the country level, we can see sort of what policies maybe have worked that we need to sort of reinforce and show continued support for. And also this could be helpful for informing policies that should be put in place. It's really useful for NGOs for a lot of reasons, including, for example, morale. So as I said, with that example for the mountain chicken frog, if you've worked on a species for 20 years, you want to be able to see that you're having some kind of an impact. So it's a great way to communicate that. It's a great way to communicate the impact of an organization and their programs to the wider audience. And also, I think it's a really valuable tool for planning. So particularly when we're thinking about those forward projections, thinking about what we could expect to achieve within a program in 10 years' time, that could be really valuable when we're planning. we think it'd be very useful for funders to be able to say that this is the past impact that we've achieved through our programme. This is what we expect to achieve in the future with our programme with your continued support. And also we think it'd be useful for public outreach. So in a lot of sort of zoo signage, we see negative stories, but actually positive stories engage with people so well that to be able to communicate what a programme has achieved is really powerful for engaging with the public. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples that I've worked on with some of my colleagues and think about how we might be able to integrate the conservation standards. So first of all, just to give an example of one of the programme examples. So this is looking at the contribution of a specific reintroduction programme in Baja California to the recovery of the California condor. So this species was very threatened by habitat destruction, poaching and lead poisoning, and it was almost wiped out. There was only 22 individuals remaining at one point. And there's several programs working together to recover this species, including reintroductions in multiple sites across the range. And so because I've been working with colleagues at San Diego Zoo, we've been focused on one specific program. And so really crucially in this program level assessment, the first part is defining the program. So we need to think about all of the partners involved. So who has contributed to the work and needs to be acknowledged as part of it? What is the geographical scope of the program? And also what kind of interventions are involved? And so as part of the program assessment, these are all recorded. And for this particular example, the geographical scope is this area of Baja California down the bottom here. And this is something where I initially see some alignment. So obviously the first stages of the conservation standards are the assessing and the planning. So again, looking at some of those exact same questions, who are the important stakeholders? What's the geographical scope? What are we trying to do? And thinking about that in the program planning. And so one of my next big steps in this work is writing up the guidelines, and something that we will need to make sure we've got very clear guidance on how to define a program. And I'm thinking that the guidance within the conservation standards will be really helpful for me, thinking about using sort of common language to get a bit more consistency in how we talk about programs. And something else that is very useful here is to consider the spatial units. So if we have already got a green status assessment produced when people are planning their programs, then these spatial units could be really useful considerations, because the range of the species has already been divided up into conservation important units and areas where we expect to see the kind of level that we expect to see a change in species recovery. So for example, this program maps beautifully onto one of the spatial units, and that's not always the case. But if we had these spatial units in consideration when planning the program, it could be really useful for helping to inform the kind of level that we need to work at to see an impact at the global level. And so when we're thinking about assessing the program impact, it's quite similar to what I introduced with the global impact. So we can understand, obviously, we've got the conservation legacy. So globally, how has conservation impacted this species? And we can use this same method of counterfactual thinking to think about the program. So rather than thinking about a future with no conservation whatsoever, we think about a future without, a past with no conservation whatsoever. We could think about a past if we had never had this program. So if the Baja California program had not been reintroducing the species in this spatial unit, we would have this program legacy. This program legacy represents the difference made by having this program reintroducing the species in this spatial unit. And you can see that it only contributes a portion of the global recovery of the species. And that makes sense because we're looking at a program in one spatial unit out of several sites where the species is being reintroduced. So it makes sense that it would contribute a portion of that global recovery. And then, but we could also think about, we will also have examples where we don't necessarily have a program legacy. So when looking back at the past impact of the program, we may get a legacy of 0. And there's lots of potential reasons for this, ranging from species biology to how new the program is, the kind of interventions. But one thing that it could be caused by is the geographical scope of the programme. So in this example, this is actually a programme working on several species in the Annamite Mountains. And specifically for this species, the organisation is working across 3 protected areas. And you'll see that actually the species, which is the red dots, is only found in one of the 3 protected areas. And this is not to say it's a flaw of the programme, because as I said, it's designed to focus on several species. But it means that for this specific species, it will be harder to see an impact of this programme purely because of the geographical scope of it. And so this is kind of reinforcing that potential to think about the geographical scope from the spatial units in a green status assessment when planning programmes in the initial stages. And so when we're thinking about assessing the past impact of a programme, there's kind of 2 different timescales that we can think about doing it. So the work that I've been doing with the green status of species, we want to understand the progress of a programme towards the global recovery of a species. And we would suggest doing this assessment every 5 to 10 years, reassessing the programme green status. And the idea is that this helps us understand the contribution of a programme towards the recovery of the species. So as I demonstrated here, comparing the global work to the programme. When we're thinking about adaptive management, we tend to do this programme evaluation on a different scale. So thinking in terms of conservation standards, we want to assess the progress of a programme towards the specific goals of that programme. So these are regular, maybe 6-monthly or yearly intervals where the progress is reviewed as part of the conservation standards cycle. And as part of this, we can record the progress of the planned and delivered actions and how they're contributing to target indicators. And a really, really key part of assessing this past programme impact is monitoring. So we use data that's collected throughout monitoring activities, to understand the programme progress. And these monitoring come up in several stages of the cycle. So whether it's planning them, actually delivering it, or analysing it afterwards. And the idea is we want to use this to understand if the results that we're expected are actually being achieved. But I think that there's a really big opportunity here to maximise the use of the data. So practitioners are already collecting monitoring data as part of their conservation standards cycle. So what if we could align this in a way that it could also be used in a green status assessment? So the same data could be used to look at, is our project actually achieving what we want it to within itself? And then on a wider scale, is it actually contributing to the global recovery of the species? And so I've thought a little about the things like the target viability assessments. So you'll all be fairly familiar with this. So thinking about what target we might want to be looking at. So in this example, it's a species of skink. A key ecological attribute, which is quite commonly used, with the population size, with the indicator of that being the number of mature individuals. And then we can categorize whether how this population is faring. So from poor all the way up to very good. And when I look at this, I kind of see some alignment with the states that we use in the green status. So going back to those 4 states that we have, the absent, present, viable, or functional, if we think in terms of red list categories, absent is extinct or extinct in the wild. This is a slightly simplified version, but present is basically the 3 threatened categories. For viable, we'd say that it's near threatened or least concern. And for functional, it must be viable, but it also must exceed that functionality threshold. So thinking about kind of translating that into the key ecological attributes for a specific target, there are already sort of guidelines for this within red listing. So the population size that we would assign to these different categories could be helpful in informing what we might set as the indicator ratings within the monitoring plan. So for example, I would say that poor or fair would be present, but in the lower, so poor being in the sort of most threatened categories and fair being in the slightly less threatened category. And these have population numbers to go with them if you think in terms of red list. And then good, we could look at a viable population, and very good, a functional population. And this is just one example, and this is quite a simplified example, but I think it illustrates well how we could potentially think about just sort of aligning the way that that success is defined between the two frameworks in a way that could mean that we could actually feed the information back and forth and use it for both. So just for one example of that, the indicator rating for this conservation standards plan. So there's yearly progress reports on the number of individuals of telfair skinks. And this is something that is practiced as part of the cycle, as part of the yearly monitoring and the yearly reporting. And then there is this, I see this as a really great opportunity to use this data that's collected anyway to inform updates on green status of species program evaluation. And so that is periodically reevaluated less frequently. And we could see that just using this information that we already have, we can see a change from present because it was falling within those threatened categories based on the number of individuals, up to viable because it's exceeding the threshold for reaching that category. So it is a simplified version, but I think it's an interesting starting point as to how we could potentially basically consider one whilst planning the other and find a way to help make information which can be used across multiple different frameworks in basically to just maximize the work that we're already doing in collecting this monitoring data. So thinking of an example, thinking about the Round Island Restoration Programme that Daryl works on, there's lots of different target species. So one thing that is important to note is with the green status assessment, they are done on an individual species. So you could have an island restoration programme that has 6, 7, 8 target species, and they would need green status assessments done individually for the species. But for this one, we could consider several targets from the Round Island Restoration Plan. We would first have to conduct a global green status assessment for the species. But as I said, these global assessments could be very helpful in planning when thinking about things like the spatial units. And then conducting a programme level green status assessment to help understand how this programme is actually contributing towards the global recovery of the species. And then these would be reevaluated, as I said, at less regular intervals. So thinking in terms of sort of 5 to 10 years as the programme progresses. And so one example from the Round Island Restoration Programme that I have assessed is the telfair skink. So this species was threatened by predation of non-native mammalian predators. It was once widespread across the whole of Mauritius, but following invasion by non-native predators, it was lost from almost all of its range, and it remained on one offshore island of Round Island. And this is an island where Daryl and their partners have worked for a long time on a long-term restoration programme. And this has included a range of activities. So starting with the removal of non-native herbivores, which were destroying the habitat, and then replanting and doing all sorts to restore the habitat. And this was so successful that the telfair skink population was actually able to naturally bounce back with the habitat restoration, to the point that there was enough individuals on Round Island that some could be taken and translocated to additional islands to give us safety net populations. And so if we look at the impact of this one, so we want to know, are we achieving impact? So again, here's the global assessment for the telfair skink. And the programme legacy is equal to the global legacy. And that's because this entire programme was working on the one remaining population of this species. So it makes sense it would have a very high legacy. We can also look at what we might expect to achieve in 10 years' time. So thinking again, this scenario of in a future scenario where we stopped all conservation, we see this quite heavy decline. When we look at the programme, if we see a future scenario where we stop the programme, so we stop all of the work on Round Island, we see the potential decline in this species. So this shows the dependence of this programme of the species on this programme. And again, you can see that in this case, it's not the same as the global. And that makes sense because we have these two safety net populations. So yes, if we stopped all the work on Round Island, we would expect to see declines. But thanks to these additional populations, this work is no longer responsible for the entirety of this population. Of this species. And so we can see from this that not only are we achieving the goals of our program, that this program is actually achieving a detectable impact at the global scale for this species. And so this is something that I think is really important for this green status analysis, is to understand, is the work that we're doing having an effect on the wider world and the global species recovery? And if it's not, then why not? So again, going back to this example where we didn't have a legacy and we don't have a expected program impact in 10 years. And again, this is potentially as a result of the geographical distribution of the sites where it's working. It could also be contributed to by the biology of the species, the time it takes to breed, the extreme rarity of the species. There's all kinds of things that can contribute to this. But if we're getting to this point where we're able to see, okay, we're not having an impact globally, then we can use this as an opportunity to question why. So if not, why not? And there's, I think, a real opportunity here to go back to the situation analysis that was carried out as part of your initial planning. So we can understand that we're not having a global impact. We want to understand where we want to understand why we're not having it. And then we can use this as an opportunity to see where could we expand? How could we increase this program to a way that we could have this larger impact? So going back to the situation model gives us an opportunity to see where we might be able to either expand the geographical scope or expand the capacity through collaborations. And it kind of gives us this taking us back to the drawing board to help us understand how we could have a bigger impact. And so finally, the other kind of general goal that I'd said about was the importance of sharing results. So the conservation standards really promotes a learning culture. It's a whole part of the cycle is about sharing. We want to share the lessons learned with colleagues, with stakeholders, with partners. And this is something that we really want to promote with the programme Green Status of Species as well. It's a standardised method to assess the impact of programmes. And this means that results can be shared and compared between different programmes and organisations because we're using this common framework. And again, I think that's really important to be able to see, perhaps look at someone else's programme that's had a really high impact, see what they've been doing, see how it's been working, and potentially apply that to our own work. So I hope that that this has all made sense and that you've enjoyed hearing more about the green status and how we could potentially work together with the Conservation Measures Partnership to kind of build some bridges and align the work that we do. I'm really open to questions and feedback. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you on that. If you do want to learn more about the green status of species, we've got a lot of resources. So we have a summary on the Red List website. There's various published documents through the IUCN. We have an online training course. There's various publications, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with me with any questions. If you did want any more information, you can also scan this QR code. This has links to various of these resources, and it also has a link to a form if you're interested in completing a green status assessment for your own study species or a species that your organisation works on. Then you can register your interest on that form, and myself and my colleagues will get back in touch with you and help work with you on facilitating that assessment. So all that's left is to thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to having some feedback and questions. And also a huge thanks to all of my partners who I've worked with on the assessments and on developing this work, and to San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance who have funded the work, so it would not have been possible without them. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to questions.